Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this, the latest in the RWFM's Turbulent Times webinar series. Today, our guest is Bruce Daisley. Bruce is a workplace evangelist, a very passionate individual when it comes to the future of work. He spent years with YouTube, 8 of them with Twitter, of course, where he was the Vice President Europe, Africa and Middle East, I believe. And he's now a writer and broadcaster focused on all things concerning improving work and work culture, essentially all about making work better. His podcast, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. If you haven't listened to a broadcast wherever you've been, you really ought to go and download one of those as soon as this webinar ends. And his book, The Joy of Work, 30 Ways to Fall in Love with Your Job Again, was a Sunday Times #1 bestseller. I'm really looking forward to the book on identity and resilience you're currently working on. Is that right? Identity and resilience?
Yeah, and community. So like these sort of big themes that I think are going to afflict the workforce going forward. Some of the which we'll hint at today, really.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, listen, let's crack on. I mean, for the viewers, stroke listeners out there, what I did with Bruce is break down a lot of our talk today around what impacts the workplace managers, and about, of course, what impacts work in general and people's experience of it. Obviously, the two are connected. Right, okay, so we agreed at the outset, we talked first about workplace managers. So, yeah, the workplace specifically, what will the future of the office of the workplace be? Now, things have changed fundamentally in the last 6 months, but prior to those 6 months, a lot of this stuff about flexible working, about the way in which people control themselves in teams was material that you were talking about and was happening to a certain degree. I guess the first question is there, has this whole 6 months worth of lockdown turbocharged that activity?
Yeah, very much so. I think, you know, it's all of us are aware that this has been a massive acceleration, maybe not a total transformation. It wasn't a change of direction, but it's been a huge acceleration in the trends that we were already starting to see. And I think, you know, the critical thing, a lot of businesses find themselves asking, what's the way for them to get transformational change? What's the way for them to transform where they are to where they want to be? And of course, one of the challenges of that is that we often struggle to make that leap. And I think almost every business in the country, certainly any business with offices, found that they probably enacted more change, certainly in the first 4-6 weeks, than they ever believed possible. I spoke to local councils who'd never had computers, laptop computers for people. They equipped everyone with that. Within 3 months, they were putting one of their buildings up for sale. So, you know, it's the amount of transformation I think we've all witnessed, and actually the amount of capability that we've been able to unlock in ourselves has probably surprised us. So it's not necessarily that this is a pivot to a completely different direction, but certainly some of the trends that we were seeing have been enacted quicker. There's a really interesting organisation that I suspect I'll reference a bit later on. There's a few companies who are remote only, and one of the remote only firms is a firm called Automatic. They make WordPress, and Automatic talk about there being stages of remote. And I was particularly interested in Automatic because they set about trying to describe how you might make your workforce productive and remote. And they still talk about various different stages of remote, 5 stages. The founder is a guy called Matt Mullenweg, and he talks about that. And one of the things he says is that we were all at stage 1 of remote. Stage 1 of remote is where you were able to take a phone call or a quick meeting from home, maybe when you were waiting for a delivery or you were waiting for someone to come home. And so we're all at stage 1 of remote. Stage 2 of remote was where you transfer some of the work that you were doing, all of the work you're doing that you were doing in the office, you transfer it to doing it at home. But there's actually several stages in his model that go beyond that. But I think most of us found ourselves going from certainly stage 1 of remote, that occasional call at home, to stage 2 at home, where we're doing pretty much everything we were doing in the office previously, but we're now doing it remotely.
Okay, that's really interesting. Workplace managers, of course, have been brought into the equation for the people returning back to work. But of course, it's going to be a balance now, isn't it, between people working remotely, people working in third spaces, and going back to the office. What's your take on our members, workplace managers' role in all this in the future?
Yeah, well, I think more than ever before, some of the people in this property space who are the most fascinating to listen to are talking about the hotelification of the property market. They're talking about space as a service, and I would have thought in the context of that, workplace managers are going to find that rather than this seeing a reduction in the demand for their work, they're going to see a heightened demand for what they can provide, for the levels of service and support that they can provide. So it will be different, no doubt, that anyone who's run a routine workplace office management previously might find that the expectations and the demands on them are different to what was there before. But most certainly we have to ask ourselves, will there be a demand for a workplace? Yes, to some extent. Will the demands on that workplace be probably more custom and more specific? Almost certainly yes. And by that I specifically mean that we used to hire a workplace. We used to hire a floor and a footprint of certain number of desk space. Now increasingly workers might be sharing a footprint which is half the size, but the people are coming in and these are co-working function for anyone who wants to come every day, or an increased meeting room capacity. Meeting rooms for two reasons really. I think maybe I'd take a step back. Broadly, what we've found ourselves doing in this in 4-6 months is asking what the purpose of the office is, and it seems to be 2-3 really clear purposes. First one is meeting people by appointment. Second one is meeting people by accident, and the third one seems to be maybe related to both of those, but forging a cohesive team feeling. And so the first one, meeting people up by appointment, it's not precisely matched by Skype and Zoom and Microsoft Teams, but it's a pretty reasonable approximation. The second one, meeting people by accident, I think it's clear that what we've discovered is that actually those chance encounters, those stolen conversations by the lift, chatting to someone while you're in the sandwich shop, they seem to have a value to them that maybe we've only just started to recognize now. They forge a connection between us, which often leads into creative moments. It often leads into sort of moments of breakthrough. When we chat socially, we're 10 times more likely to chat in the business capacity. And the third part is team cohesion. I think a lot of us probably in the 5th or 6th month of lockdown found ourselves thinking, it doesn't feel the same. I'm missing people. I've got this rose-tinted perspective of even the people I couldn't stand in the office. And so I think that team cohesion is something not to be underestimated. In terms of anyone who might be watching this, well, look, all of those functions, certainly function 2 and function 3, are going to be calling upon the workplace and the office more than ever before. So I think the demand for the workplace and the demand for a place of work is going to be greater than ever before. The services and the levels of expectations of what that workplace might deliver, I suspect, might look slightly different.
Okay, that's understandable, true. And of course, there are so many potential ways for each individual organisation to go with how it manages its displaced workers and that office space. There's going to be so many demands on organisations to consider the lease breaks, consider the options they have to repurpose offices. As we say, some of this clearly was going on before. I mean, we've reported it for years. It's happening. It just feels, as you said, as if it's an acceleration of this. But in terms of the skill sets of managers, the people that are going to see this through, what's your take on what people are going to need to be able to be as managers? And I mean this both in terms of the office manager, the workplace manager, people running the facilities, as much as team managers of individual work groups.
Well, I think there's going to be a few changes. I mean, the first thing is when we look in in terms of the overall impact of this. Morgan Stanley published something last week that said that if remote working becomes 10, 15, 20% of the office, then the demand for office space is going to decline by about 20, 25%. So firstly, we're going to see the footprints of offices is almost certain to fall. Why? Because not everyone will need an individual desk. I think a lot of firms will recognise that there's a moment for them to rationalise the amount they spend on workplaces. Maybe, you know, the model of the Apple Store isn't a bad one, where we'll have something that shows off the company to customers in a beautiful light. In fact, some of the remote-only companies have talked about they often kept WordPress's company Automatic, Basecamp, who are another software company, both of them kept small office footprints, often in near sort of investor communities, to show off the company with a bit of razzle dazzle. It actually sort of has no bearing on any work being done, but it allows you to sort of bring people in and show them this sort of beautifully crafted show, like an Apple Store, like it's sort of a place to show off your wares. So I suspect that, you know, demand for those things will remain, but the overall demand for workspace is going to be lower. But then what does it mean? Well, I think the critical thing that any organization is going to be thinking about, they're going to be thinking about how can they curate an experience both for their employees and for customers with the space that they have. So the Apple Store being a good model. If you've got workers coming in 2 days a week, or if you've got workers coming in 2 weeks a year, JP Morgan, an investment bank firm, said that their new model was they're going to have 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, like the oil rigs. Imagine that. JP Morgan going down an oil rig route, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. But when you're in that, those 2 weeks have to represent a sort of energized, positive, culturally resonant experience. And I think, you know, that's what we're going to get. The other skill that I think probably none of us have even really considered, although you will encounter these people in WeWorks currently, is the notion of community manager. So someone whose job it is to build a community, either inside the space or outside the space. So, you know, a few of us might have found that we were creating things that extended into the social sphere in our workplaces. We were trying to use workplaces for entertainment, exercise, energization, training. I think those things will ascend in importance, that having a community manager. I remember going into a WeWork office 12 months ago, and there were a lot of fabulously extrovert individuals whose job it was inside their space to turn this blank canvas into an experience. They were sort of like the greeters inside American retail stores. And I think that degree of trying to ensure that if people are in the office for less time, that their experience is more transformational. And so that community manager, that energizing force will be quite important, I think.
That's really interesting, of course, because from the perspective of the workplace and facilities managers, they're doing that, of course. You could argue historically it's much more about the comfort factors, the heat, the light, and that's absolutely true. But you can add community to that, particularly in a situation in which you will always have groups of people who are not in one central location. And I guess, well, can I ask, do you believe that we will see more of the kind of the local hubs and the renaissance of the high streets around smaller service offices perhaps, or small hubs for companies that will retain a certain amount of the central city space for just the kind of razzmatazz you mentioned?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I think the critical thing I would suggest is that no one really knows what the answers are right now. And so everyone's trying to do their working out in public. I chatted to the organisation that represents the human resources, the people managers. It's sort of a body, the Institute of Chartered People Management, I think. And they were talking about how the critical thing right now is that no one's got the answers. So it's about finding easy and permissible entries and exit points to experiments. So that might be an organisation is thinking, what can we test right now? You know, we might have some form of lockdown persisting for the next 12 months. And so what can we do that will allow us to to put some stabilizer wheels on, to experiment with different forms of culture without feeling committed to this being resolutely the thing that we're going to stick with forevermore. And I think, you know, that's one of the interesting challenges. That's where we probably are right now, that a lot of organizations are willing to experiment with things, but not willing to commit. The point you make is really critical. A lot of people who've been responsible for curating the experience inside a building have, to some extent, felt responsible for the experience for community building. But I think even more explicitly, this will be thinking, how do we create a community amongst the people who are always remote all the time, the people who are in the office? You know, younger workers may elect to come into the office 5 days a week. How do we sort of forge a collective identity by creating experiences for everyone? One of the things I've mentioned, Automatic, the WordPress company, a few times. WordPress power sort of a third of the sites on the internet, and so they're like a secret success. They often make some of the things that you consume online, but they talk about things in a really interesting way. They say the old model of work was that we work 11 months a year in the office, and then 1 month a year away from the office, sort of on holiday. They say our model is you work 11 months a year away from the office, and then 1 month a year, they don't have an office, but they say 1 month a year with your colleagues. And they say, to break it down, 1 week every quarter, no excuses accepted. You will be expected to put your pet carers on call, to put your babysitter on bonus, and to get yourself to one place where we're going to spend an energized, connective week. And it's really interesting because what you witness in that is they recognize that there appears to be no substitute for people getting together. So they've recognized in sort of a decade or so of experience that you can't replace that physicality of human relationships, that connection. And so then I think, look, what does that tell us about the rest of the world? That probably the rest of the world, we're not going to abandon offices anytime soon. But the time we're in the office, we're going to have to make sure that the experience justifies the journey. And look, you know, something to think about for the reason why the office was a pretty good fit for productive working previously was that it had a great network effect. You'd make the average British commute is 74 minutes. You'd make the 74-minute commute in. But when you got to the office, the big boss was there, the marketing team was there, there was a research person around the corner, there was a sales team that you could draw upon. There was a good network effect. And what we're going to discover is either when only half the office or a third of the office are in every day, is that the network effect of the office can be easily diluted. And that means that people are going to be very quickly facing sort of an intellectual reckoning. They've just made this long journey in, they're wandering around, and yeah, absolutely, there's a nicer coffee machine, the internet's faster, they can photocopy and print things, but unless there's this network effect, unless there's like a critical mass of colleagues, next time they set about on that journey, on that sort of long journey in the rain, they're going to think, shall I just stay here and work here? And that's the challenge. So any of us need to be thinking, what is the office for? And making sure that those moments when people do come in are capable of energizing and sort of inspiring the team in a more effective way.
So would you think that there's going to be pretty much the same amount of workspace, perhaps in central city locations, but occupied by considerably more companies because they will take small amounts of space as individual organizations for just the kind of experience-led activities themselves? And so we'll see the same volume of business activity, or do you think inevitably we're going to see it dispersed across the suburbs, as it were, as organizations work this kind of thing out? I know that's a prediction, but what do you think?
Yeah. So I think some of the people, there's certainly a few trial balloons who are trying to work out what's happening. And so one of these is the notion of work near home. And, you know, this what a small hub in Haggerton or Homerton in East London contacted me, said, we've got this co-working space for people who don't want to make the journey in, but do want to create a sort of separation between, they've got a small flat by by necessity, people have bought a small flat that they can just about afford to live in. They didn't factor in having to have space to work, and so now for a couple of £100 a month, they can sort of have a space to work in. So there is an attempt to build this work near home suggestion. It's interesting, the Mayor of Paris talks about the 15-minute city. Everything you need should be within 15 minutes of your front door. And so, you know, we almost are returning to sort of more of a villagey feel, where to get around for most day-to-day activities is by foot or by bike, and it's only sort of big outings that we might set about in a car or a public train. So there's definitely a discussion on those things. I think it's highly conceivable that we will see a bit of generational stratification. So one of the things that we might be looking at here is, if you imagine that Morgan Stanley there made a pretty modest prediction, actually. They said if 15% of work goes remote, 15 to 20%, then the demand for office space will go down by 20-25%. So working on the basis that, okay, the inputs into that seem modest, and so the outputs are probably pretty modest, that there's going to be a whole load of what is currently office space that is no longer needed for that. And, you know, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating experiment for a glass of wine in hand to start reflecting on what might happen. Certainly, there's some people who believe that one of the things might happen from this is that we will expect loft living to be an option, as people who own space in city centres start thinking, well, maybe I could flip this to residential and either rent or sell these spaces. Or in addition, I think we're going to find that there's an opportunity for us to look at cities in different ways. And I guess, you know, it's very difficult because you're playing three-dimensional chess 8 moves ahead. But, you know, when you are finishing your glass of Pinot there, if you can sort of reflect on what that might look like. And I guess one of the things that might happen is we find workers in their 20s are thrilled and find it appealing to live in this metropolitan life, where maybe they live in a loft in a city centre, they go to an office, partly social, partly work-based. And then as we progress through life, we find that actually a life with a bit of a garden and living maybe a little bit further out is a more agreeable way for the pace of life that we've got there. And you know, there's so many levels of guessing there that I'd sort of invite anyone to make their own guesses and assumptions at that. But one of the things that's almost certain is that the demand for property, almost certainly by almost every prediction, is going to be less. And so as a consequence, it does beg the question, what will we do with that property?
Well, that's a big question mark, which fine, we'll have to leave hanging, of course, because there's so much riding on it, and so many aspects of the way the corporate real estate market operates at the moment, particularly in the big city centres, is up for debate. And it's very interesting to see some of the government legislation that in recent years has tried to successfully as well get organisations, get developers, get businesses and occupiers to consider things like the environmental capability, the quality of the new built stock and the retrofit of existing stock. And just at the time when there seems to be a coalescing of all parties towards the 2050 net zero carbon goal, this throws us a googly in terms of who's actually going to be occupying. But let's put that to one side now. Ask a bit about you know, your recent work, because of course with these teams working now for the last 6 months remotely, it feels to me as if a lot of what you've been talking about with your various guests is at least, it's in play at least, the psychology of teams and the issue of trying to have monocultures, for example, and that being a failing proposition, and that teams can organise their own characters to create said company culture. There's a whole range of different dynamics going on here in terms of how such teams are managed, the autonomy, that is another key aspect of what you're keen to see, and the way in which people go around delivering their work, the output management that is now essential, as opposed to the presenteeism. You've spoken before about open plan offices and how they can be detrimental. So what's your take generally now on where we are? Are we seeing a lot of don't want to be overly positive, but are there a lot of really good signs as a result of all this, or are there negatives too?
I think, what we're generally going to get is we're going to get, well, firstly, we're not in post-COVID yet. We're in mid-COVID, and so it's very difficult for us, firstly, to be critical of anything that a firm might find themselves doing right now, because all of us are pretty much trying to navigate and cope with uncertainty, complexity, and trying to keep the lights on. And I saw one estimate that unemployment is possibly set to be in excess of 5 million. So I think any of us who are managing to keep our firms going and our jobs secure will regard ourselves as doing well right now. The long term, though, I do think that probably what we're going to get is more stratification of work than we've ever seen. There's an interesting website called Glassdoor, and Glassdoor is where any individual can go and post a review of their employer. Like Amazon, you can go on, and broadly sort of the two different cohorts of people who might go on there: people who are in love with their jobs and people who maybe are disaffected. So you get an interesting polarization of people going to post their reviews. But people are asked on there what their experiences are like. Well, the number one criteria that anyone gives for working at a firm is the workplace culture of that firm. Really interesting. They rank it higher than work-life balance. They rank it higher than perks and benefits, than salary. So workplace, our experience, how something makes us feel, seems to be just a reminder that humans connect emotionally, and this is an important criteria for us. Next thing is, I think on that website, on the Glassdoor website, there's been till now, if you worked at chocolate manufacturer A or chocolate manufacturer B in their head office, broadly your experience was pretty much the same. So people would switch from Nestle to Cadbury's to somewhere else afterwards, and they would say, my experience was pretty much the same. I think increasingly that's not going to be the case. I generally make a point of trying to chat to 4 or 5 different businesses every week, get perspective from the housing sectors to the government sector to hospitals to technology firms. And I'm always astonished by the vast array of experiences. Some firms tell me, look, we've got a rule, no more than 6 hours video calls a week, and we limit it, and they're in half-an-hour chunks. Other firms say to me, I pretty much spend my day from 9 a.m. Monday till 6 a.m. Friday on video calls. And so, there's this very different polarization. And I think, firstly, most of us have recognized some degree of screen fatigue through this time we're living through. And in addition, that we probably recognize that in aggregate, we feel frazzled from the way we've been working over the last few months. I think imagining how some of this will be captured in Glassdoor reviews is really fascinating, because a new school leaver or graduate might think, okay, I'm going to go and work at this firm, heard great things. They'll go on to Glassdoor and someone will say, buyer beware, this is literally Zoom calls from Monday to Friday. And they think, okay, that's not what I want to do. Or other people might say, actually, this is incredible. It's a job filled with autonomy and responsibility. My boss is there as a coach. I chat to them once or twice a week. And, I also have this human connection whenever I need it. And so, I think there's going to be a really differentiated experience across different employers, and that's potentially the opportunity. I think anyone who's sitting thinking about this right now, someone who's maybe in facilities management, thinking, they should be thinking with the leadership of their organization, what do we want people to say about our company on Glassdoor in 12, 18 months time? Because actually, as a vision for where you're trying to get, and for a motivating driving factor of how to get there, it helps you create a very concrete, a very clear image in your mind, I think.
That's really interesting in terms of how those facilities managers are going to communicate with the groups. I find that whole thing really intriguing, because there are going to be myriad ways of doing it. It's not going to be site A, site B, site C, as perhaps it was historically. And there's going to be that need for, you referred earlier to the community manager aspect of this. I wonder if it's something that we've that people are prepared for, and whether or not there is the right amount of I guess the human skill set, the softer side of the skill set is going to be required to deal with individual team managers in a way that perhaps wasn't done before, rather than see everyone together in one hit. Do you think there are abilities that workplace and facilities managers need to focus on that perhaps they haven't done as much of in the past?
Yeah, I think adaptability is probably going to be the critical one. I think any of us probably, when I've chatted to building architects and building designers, they've said that, the ability to re-customize, to re-edit, to re-adapt is one of the most critical requirements of buildings that are being constructed now. And I think, what goes for the hardware goes for the software, really. So, any of us thinking that we know the way that things are done around here, and we want to preserve the way they're done around here. Certainly, I think the organisations that will benefit the most are the ones who say, we recognise we're going to try 50 things this year. 20 of them are going to be so abject bad as failures that we're going to wish no one will ever mention it again. 10 of them might seem really brilliant. One of them might seem so heroic we'll wish we'll wonder how we ever survived without it. But I think, thinking out how you can treat the way you use your space as new product development, and really sort of to characterize what you're doing with a willing sense of entering into it, thinking that failure is one of the likely outcomes here. I think it's through that. It's through talking to other people in different organizations, listening to what's happening. One of the things I found most energizing myself in the last few months is listening to different firms trying to reconcile this. Like you've mentioned, I do a podcast, and on the most recent 2 episodes, I just chatted to 6 different businesses and said, like, what's the plan? And, broadly, you would characterize all of them as being filled with uncertainty, but wanting to not allow uncertainty to prevent them from making decisions. So some firms said, go on.
I felt as if they were incredibly positive, but the sense I got from them was that, yes, they felt uncertain, but this they felt was real. It came across as they felt there was opportunity in reformatting how they do things.
Very much so. And I think, it comes in 2 levels. There was one firm that was a defence contractor that's sort of, very stable, a lot of people of a certain age working there, who tradition has been an important way that they've preserved quality. And, ensuring that the way that things were done around here was not yielding to short-term whims was a really important way of doing things. And what it's allowed them to do is to at least pose a few questions. Why are we doing this? Could we do it in a better way? Other firms have tried to see that invention could be one of their superpowers, and being more imaginative could be one of the things that propels them to faster growth and to faster development. So it sometimes depends on where companies are on the sort of the life scale, the life cycle of companies. But absolutely, I think, it's really clear that everyone recognizes there's been a void and we've been unable to make decisions. As we now enter into a period where there's a degree more flexibility we're allowed to go out, we're allowed to meet in some capacity, we're allowed to go into restaurants and bars, and so as a consequence we're allowed to do some stuff in the office, and so they're just working out how to do it. And broadly, what most of them have recognized is that work without the people doesn't feel quite the same. And so in what capacity can they get people to energize each other, to inspire each other, to entertain each other? Because it seems to be, if they can access some of those things, that work seems to be a more agreeable place for us to spend our time, really.
So obviously, we're now coming up to 6 months of lockdown, and a lot of what you talk about makes perfect sense, and clearly people are talking about it. In some larger organizations, do you think there might be an issue? I mean, we've heard about companies being pleasantly surprised at the ability for their people working remotely to continue to be productive, if not perhaps more so in some cases. Is there still sometimes a connection issue between the people that run the business at the very top and those that perhaps are energized and enthusiastic about this kind of change, and there's often a disconnect?
Yeah, I mean, look, the disconnect is the disconnect that's perennial, really. The management thinker, Sir Kerry Cooper, he talks about the line manager lottery, and he says that, you know, far more of our experience of work is determined by our direct manager than anything else. Your company can have bean bags on the floor, it can have dogs scurrying around, it can have a jelly bean wall, it can have all manner of luxury perks. But if your manager is disagreeable, then you think you've got a bad job. And so managers, far more than anything else, determine this. And I think that's one of the challenges of this. Early in lockdown, someone told me that their company, it's a telecommunications company of a few hundred people, but their company was seeing a very differentiated experience. Those managers who had no childcare responsibilities themselves, or no empathy to what that was like, to what having responsibility for other living things was like, were reacting very differently to those who had people that were going feral in the next room. And I think, you know, that was one of the challenges, that not all of us can be on video calls for 14 hours a day without causing starvation to small people. And it was the challenge that this organization had, was that there was an empathy gap. These high-flying young managers who believed that everyone could go back to back, meeting to meeting, weren't necessarily recognizing the need for punctuation and interruption for everyone else. So obviously, sort of some degree of recognizing that everyone's situation is different is obviously one of the most important things. And it's just an illustration, really, that we've been battling adversity here. This has been a difficult scenario for a lot of us, suboptimal, but there does seem to be a lot of positive learnings from it.
So the autonomy, of course, one of the key components to a lot of what you suggest people need in order to be happy at work. I wonder whether some of that has now been made available. Clearly, you know, in our teams, generally speaking, in knowledge work anyway, everyone's remote anyway. They've been forced to be remote from the individuals. There are collective ways in which people come together to talk. But I wonder if you get a sense that the positive aspects of being able to better frame your day. You don't have to commute. You don't necessarily have to speak to that individual you didn't like to speak to. Do you think there are some of these positives to a lot of what you were looking for that are kind of now happening out there? We're just not seeing them at the moment, or is that being too Pollyanna-ish?
Yeah, I think it's probably too early to say. I've definitely seen enough organisations in the last month who've said we're mandating all of our team back to the office, and to some extent, I can try and empathise. The organisations I've seen doing it have had, you know, there's been a couple of national newspapers. So City AM were pretty public. They said we want everyone back to the office. Well, you know, it's no surprise that City AM is a free sheet distributed to financial workers, mainly in the city, but also across London and the big conurbations around the country. And, you know, from their perspective, people not being in the office has meant that there's been no circulation for their product. And so to some extent, it's almost like, if I wish hard enough, will Wednesday become Saturday? Well, no matter how hard I wish, I'm not sure Wednesday will become Saturday, but it doesn't stop us thinking that our life would be a lot better if there was another Saturday in the middle of the week. And go on.
Sorry. No, I was just going to say, you've spoken before about being able to determine weekdays of the week. This was prior to COVID, of course. That would be the best for the optimum coming together of a particular team, etc. And now we're here. We're kind of almost doing that. There are ways in which some people could determine that they could work 4 rather than 5 days a week, for example. So I wonder whether that's something that's going on in the background.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot of second order effects that no one has even considered yet. So, I've seen, to that City AM point, they wanted their journalists and they wanted their salespeople in. Salespeople, I suspect whoever runs the sales team there is thinking, well, the old heuristic that we've got is that the more that salespeople see customers, the more revenue, the more pages they book in the newspaper. Of course, what is neglected from that simple Excel model is the idea that you might not be able to see customers because you might mandate that everyone comes back to the office, but your customers might not. And so we can all make very small first order mistakes trying to restore ourselves to the way that the world was, and it wouldn't be the same. So, will those salespeople now be trying to book Zoom meetings in or Microsoft Team meetings? Very possibly. Will they have the same effect as someone pressing a latte into your hand and speaking in an energized way? Probably not. Or someone taking you out on a long boozy lunch? Probably not. And so I think what these things, by wanting to return to the old ways, these through politics, through entertainment, there's always a desire for nostalgia because we can understand the old world and it's more easy to assimilate into our thinking. But what we generally discover is no matter how much we want the past to come back, it doesn't come back in the way that we expected. So I think, there's most certainly organizations who are probably thinking, I want my sales team back all the time. I think probably a more interesting question for those people to ask is to say, okay, if we had the sales team back 1 or 2 days a week, what days would we achieve the objectives of a good sales team? And that might be energizing the team, it might be inspiring the team, it might be sort of driving a more dynamic rate. It might additionally be asking themselves, okay, most products differentiate undifferentiated products by adding a layer of service on top. Whether you're selling brooms, windows, cars, or pages in City AM, you normally made sure that you sold more than your competitor by having nicer service or more attractive salespeople or more entertaining salespeople, and you added a layer of service over the top. And the question that be really interesting for those organizations to be thinking about right now is, what's the new layer we add over the top? It might be that we have quarterly events. It might be that we invite people to exclusive conferences or moments of insight. It might be that we actually up the ante and we take people to more entertaining gatherings. But thinking about how you differentiate and add the layer on top in a different era is far more valuable than thinking, I want everyone back to the office from 8:30 on Monday.
Well, the other interesting part of that, of course, is that increasingly it's clear that you can make provisions for different types of people within different teams. Part of the conversation that goes on a lot is we don't want all the people to be the same. We want to have a variety of characters within our business, because we know that if we employ people just in our image, we're going to continue to do the same rather than do something different. And from that perspective, that makes this a particularly exciting time, right? Because there are it is all experimentation. We're all up in the air as to how all the cards are going to fall. Do you share that sense that this is a potentially, of course, absolutely about the recession? It's not going to be pretty at all, but in the medium term, that there is great potential for the joy of work, the happiness you seek for each individual worker. That we can make an upgrade that affects all of us.
Yes and no. So I would say that it's going to be unevenly distributed. I think, what we've witnessed is that I think the latest stats say that between 10 and 20% of people say that their mental health has suffered during this disruption. And I think, in aggregate, we might say that the research is that broadly people have enjoyed working from home. So when you look at the top line research, there's definitely a lot of conflict running through the findings. About 2/3 of people say they want to keep working from home. In fact, if you ask them, they want to keep working from home 4 days a week. Is about sort of people who want to keep working from home. About 80% of them want to stay working 4 days a week. So, but in addition, there's about 60% of people who say they're missing the office. So can you have both? Well, absolutely you can, but it's an illustration that we do want our cake and eating it. But, you know, hidden in all that, we might look at that and go, okay, I've spotted the trends here. Hidden in all of that, there are these 10% of people who say their mental health has deteriorated. Obviously, a lot of people, when they were electing to live in the way they live, didn't think they were going to be in that environment for an additional 60 to 80 hours a week. So, you know, these young people who have chosen housemates that they're now feeling like they've gone on a 6-month cruise with, and they're chained to these disagreeable housemates, and there's no easy escape. Or there's people who, I've been on calls, and a woman said to me, I think, you know, there's a lot of bias in the way that I'm perceiving things. She said, I'm a mum, I've got 2 teenagers in the house. I've found that my time in lockdown has seen an exponential increase in the amount of domestic chores that I've done, and I cannot wait to get back to the office. So I think, you know, what we're really clear on is that probably at a time, probably we're trying to be more inclusive and see things from different perspectives. I think it's just a reminder there's even more perspectives than that, than maybe we sometimes think. So absolutely, what's the way that we can perceive that woman in her 50s experience, or what's the way that we can, what's it going to feel like to be an underrepresented minority in an office when now no one hears your voice, no one sees you, you don't feel like you've got permission to contribute. So I think, you know, understanding those things is going to be remain a really important consideration here.
But that circles back to the whole idea of the community manager, that person who's not just looking after the physical capability of the office environment, but is considering what are the requirements of the individuals within particular work groups, and they will differ. There are people that actually prefer the commute because it allows them to segment their day into ways in which they prefer to have their working days. Now, of course, as you said, you can't do that for everybody, but this idea that there are people who will consider individual people's requirements to be the most productive, whatever their location, that's definitely something for the immediate future, right?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I think the critical thing of where we are right now is there's so many interesting questions being posed. There's so many things that I think, look, for the first time, we're in a situation where we can design work. Most of us joined a workplace and it was characterized by tradition, and, whether we joined the workforce in the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, even the 2010s, we witnessed a version of work and we learned that's what work is like. And all of us, I'm old enough to join the workforce when it was paper diaries. And let me tell you that a lot of people very reluctantly gave up their paper diaries because it gave someone else permission to put meetings in their calendar. But what happened was very quickly they were perceived as dinosaurs, and but there were also people in the late 90s who said, I don't do email, I'm not doing email. And of course, if they were senior enough, they got away with it. If they were more junior, they quickly learned that they needed to yield. And I think, we're in a situation now where for the first time, we're actually having the opportunity to design work. So it allows us to ask the question, what are we doing? What's the job we're doing? Really obvious one is that if anyone's found themselves needing to see a doctor in the last 6 months, you'll have probably found that you were offered a video consultation. Now, the remarkable thing is that this technology has been on our phones for a decade, and most definitely on everyone's phone for 5 years. And, we're sitting there screaming, but it took this disruption for us to see the opportunity of seeing doctors on a consultation. Of course, the next disruption might be you'll be able to see doctors 24/7. And there can be someone who can consult with you at 2 a.m. in the morning on video call. And immediately, that's like one of those transformational things that enhances the standard of living, it enhances the benefits to us. It took this disruption to do it. So I think for all of us, there's the exciting opportunity now to design what work looks like, for us to reframe what the problem is we're trying to solve, and then say what is, without limitations, without guardrails, what's the best way to solve that. So for anyone, actually, it's a really exciting time. And that might be, you know, for people watching this, what is the space we use going to look like? Is it going to be more private booths? Is it going to be more meeting spaces? Is it going to be more ideas rooms? What is it going to be? I think allowing us to design the solutions for that is a really exciting opportunity facing us all right now.
That's perfect. And Bruce, you've done exactly what I was just about to do, which is wrap this up in a wonderful way, the design of future work. Love it. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. It's been excellent. We could have been here for another hour. And I look forward very much to your next book. That sounds really interesting. And if you do, excuse me for a second, I now need to go through the procedurals at the end of these webinars. So thank you very much, Bruce. The first slide shows you that we have the Insight Hub for everyone, every IWFM member and viewer of this webinar. It's the latest research reports, good practice guides, guidance notes, content hubs, all available on the address here. This is the COVID-19 resources page. There is so much going on this page that if you haven't seen it, you may be pleasantly surprised. I know it gets updated routinely. Yeah, do get in touch. As we've just been discussing, there are so many case studies out there for each individual organisation and how it's going about working through the pandemic. And we'd love to hear from you about your experiences and indeed anything relating to what you've just heard. This is the umpteenth in the IWFM's webinar, Turbulent Times webinar series. There will be another one at this time next week, or certainly next week. Please check to be sure, because I'm not entirely sure exactly what date this goes out. But yes, absolutely. Do keep in tune with the continuing Turbulent Times webinar series. And thank you very much for being with us today.